Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Burwell School's virtual event, which is Impolite Conversations. And today, Jimmy Holcomb will be talking with Hillsborough's own Stephanie Trueblood. Jimmy is our own Dick Cavett. And the actual title of this series is Impolite Conversations with Creators and Makers, by which we mean people who make things happen by creating them, which is certainly what Stephanie does. This is the third in the series. And the first two conversations were with Hal Crowther, firebrand writer, and John Bierman, nationally known artist who now lives in Hillsborough. So what we really wanted to do with this series is to explore the possibilities of spontaneity that happen in genuine conversation, to get at the roots of creativity, and to do it all in a community setting. And so that people can recognize the amount of creativity that's actually happening in our community and celebrate it. So who's Jimmy? Jimmy's a designer, an artist, a writer, a dancer, a gardener. After 10 years of working in editorial design in New York City and Madrid, he returned to North Carolina, where he's lived since he was 18 months old. He saw the light early. And with his husband, architect Fred Stewart, he's more than halfway through to his goal of seeing all the important Renaissance gardens of Italy, but not this year, sadly. Jimmy's always been a keen observer, even in grade school. In fourth grade, on the school bus, he was taking notes on his fellow passengers, and he has them to this day. People always want to connect with Jimmy. He's just got the empathy gene, and he can talk to anybody. He loves to talk to people. His Instagram account had more than 100 followers before he'd ever posted a single thing. And one of his posters finally convinced him to post a few drawings. He also was a great cook. I would have put great cook on that list. And I've known a lot of great cooks in my life, but I have never known another one to make his own tonic water. That's the kind of curiosity Jimmy has, which I think is one of his most valuable qualities. I think we can start now, but when the program ends, there will be time for questions, at least 10 minutes of questions. So if you have a question, look for the little blue box on the right, the chat box, click it, type in your question, and we'll read them at the end of the program, and you'll get answers. So Jimmy and Stephanie, start talking.
Okay. Thank you, Fran.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Fran and Kate, both, and everyone at Burwell for wanting to keep these going during these strange times. Otherwise, if it weren't for the computer, we would be in that little room at the Burwell School itself, and it might be a super spreader event. So this is good. We can do this safely. And thank you, Stephanie, for wanting to chat with us. So I'll just do a little bit about Stephanie's life and then what I think has happened in Stephanie's life so far, and then she can correct me. So you grew up in Chapel Hill, Stephanie, is that right?
It is.
But you sort of hung around Hillsborough because you had friends in Hillsborough, and Hillsborough had some interesting things. It had a skating rink and it had things going on. So then this was in the 80s, 90s, I guess you were growing up in this area. And then you went to University of Georgia in Athens, did your undergraduate work. And I guess there was a design degree with some art involved as well. And so then you came back to Chapel Hill and went to UNC and did some master's work. And that was and you had a sort of a concentration in planning and history and design, preservation, but your degree was in regional planning, is that right?
Yeah,
Regional
exactly.
planning. And so then you got your degree, here you were, back in your hometown, basically. And I'm gonna say you came to Hillsborough and demanded that they hire you, right? And so then you were hired as planner, I guess, was your first job in Hillsborough, which you did for 10 years. And then you did a couple of years of let's call project planning. And I'm guessing I may know what that was involved with. We can talk more about that. So then you took your current job, which is more of a, are you called manager of public spaces manager?
Exactly.
And so you've been in that position for 4 years now?
Exactly. Yep.
Is that kind of accurate so far?
Yeah, you're doing a great job. Great summary.
I haven't a lot so far. And so, you know, the obvious question, I guess, is why city planning? Why planning? And I remembered that there was this early computer game called SimCity, which was about, I think it was about city planning. Is that right? It was about plan a city and design a city and grow it. Did you do SimCity? Did you play?
Not at
Nope.
all. Not at all. I arrived at city planning from a landscape design background. So just to fill in a couple of the, spaces in between your excellent summary. Before I went to University of Georgia, my first college was Warren Wilson College, which is just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And it's a small private school that really focuses on environmental sustainability. But I was an art major. I was a fine art major and philosophy, actually. And Warren Wilson, even though I was only there as a student for 1 year, it absolutely shaped me as a person. Leaving Chapel Hill and going to Swananoa, and it's a work college. I was assigned to the landscaping crew, and I learned to run a chainsaw and drive a backhoe and mix cement, and I learned horticulture, and that was a part of me really woke up at Warren Wilson. But, I was young and needed to be even more woke, so I dropped out of college and I went to India for a year, and I lived in India. And that was just also an incredibly formative experience, really changed my perspective on almost everything. And then when I came back from India, Warren Wilson hired me as their landscape supervisor. So instead of returning as a student, I returned as a staff person, and I worked for about 4 years in landscape design and reinstalled the formal gardens at Warren Wilson and built a lot of their gardens and landscaping. And then I transferred into UGA, where I studied design and fine art. Fine art was my major, with an emphasis in public art and large outdoor installations with somewhat of a political theme. And so that's kind of, there's a hole in there that it's hard to get in a short summary. But city
Right.
planning, when I was at the University of Georgia, my final semester, I took a class it was like a required core class, and it was a geography class called Geography of Environment and Natural Resources. And it was really about the scarcity of resources and sort of promoting sustainability. And I read the Aldo Leopold Land Ethic essay, which is a fantastic essay. And in one line in that essay says, the world needs city planners. The world needs planners. And I had never even heard of city planning before that essay, but I remember the moment I read that line and I thought, oh my God, that is who I am. And I really didn't even have a definition for it yet, but it felt right. And so I applied to graduate school, and the rest is sort of history. But I have always had a very sort of forward thinking mentality. I like to think in advance and problem solve. And so the part of my brain that loves design and problem solving and community and art and landscaping all came together in planning. The part of me that was very far behind was the computer, the computer part of it, because I sort of missed that. I'm just old enough to have not grown up with computers. And so I had to catch up. I had a lot of catching up to do.
Right. And so did you, when you realized the city planning was going to be a life of yours, did you kind of instantly think, oh, Hillsborough is the place for me? They need a planner. Kind of latch on to Hillsborough as a kind of a dream job early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I'm sure some of the people who are participating in this webinar will remember Tom Campanella, who was a member of our community, and he was also my graduate professor at UNC. And so my specialty at UNC in graduate school was history, design, and preservation, and he was the faculty member in charge of that specialty and helped me, through my thesis. And my thesis in graduate school was actually on the viability of creating design standards for Hillsborough based on several case studies that I looked at around the country. Standards for outside of the historic district, because when I was going through school, of course, we already had the historic district here in Hillsborough, but there really wasn't anything guiding design for outside of the historic district. And it's very, it's a tricky subject in North Carolina, but that's what my thesis was on. And Tom, of course, was on the planning board at the time and knew Margaret and Eric. And so we all got to know each other while I was in graduate school.
I see. Yeah. That didn't know that story about Tom. And and I want to get back to India, which I think you have told me that you were there, where you traveled by yourself. In other words, this was a trip that you took by yourself.
Yeah, it's a funny story. I was supposed to go with my school, with Warren Wilson. They had a trip planned for India, and I was going to go as a sophomore. And then right before they scheduled the trip, they decided that sophomores weren't eligible, and you could only go on these, big semester-long trips if you were a junior or a senior. And that made me so mad that I dropped out of school and decided to go on my own. So I took my money back I got my deposit back and bought an airplane ticket just to prove them wrong. And so my dad was nervous about, I was 20 years old at the time, and he was nervous about me going to India by myself. So he actually came with me for the first 3 weeks. Oh. And we landed together and made our way from Bombay all the way to Bangalore and Mysore, and we traveled through Karnataka together and saw a lot of the ancient Hoysala temples in South India. And then he went up to Dharamsala and flew home. And then I stayed for an additional 10 months. So that 3 weeks felt like a lifetime's worth of adventure. A lot can happen in India in 3 weeks. But so I wasn't alone in the very beginning. And then there was a point in my trip where I actually met up with that school group that was there, just to see my friends. So
is it Chandigarh? That's really a kind of a iconically planned new city, Chandigarh up in the north.
Yes.
Did you, your planning brain, did you go there and and look around Chandigarh?
Most of my time in India was spent in very small villages. I tended to avoid the cities. I grew up, as you mentioned, in Chapel Hill, and I'm not a city person at all. I don't even understand how cities work. My husband's from Chicago, and he makes fun of me. I don't like stoplights in general. So I'm more of a country roads kind of person. And so when I was in India, I avoided the big cities, and I really traveled in very small villages. I traveled by bus. I traveled by bicycle, sometimes 2 people on a bicycle and rickshaw. And then in the very end, I was in Delhi for a little bit of time, but it was overwhelming to me. A city that big was totally overwhelming.
Hmm. So this was not a city planning kind of experience for you. It was a life experience.
Yeah, and I think without knowing it, a spiritual experience. You know, I was only 20 at the time, but I think that society and that culture has, you know, an ancient wisdom to it. And I was welcomed by everyone I met. And I just felt really, you know, warmly welcomed in that country. And I learned a lot about Hinduism, and I learned a lot about yoga. And I think I just learned also about community. I think a lot of my understanding of community comes from growing up in a college town, but then also spending time at Warren Wilson and spending time in India, where you know, your safety and your security comes from your network of people. And I think that's probably what drew me to Hillsborough, because I feel similarly about our town, is that our network is what makes us, you know, stronger together.
Right. That planning really is about people, not things.
Exactly.
Ultimately, I'm putting words into your mouth, but
those are good words.
I'm getting a little bit of a rebel vibe.
My mother might agree with you, but my dad is more of a rebel than I am. So.
Well, you got some of it, let's just say. And I did do some looking around, and I could not come up with a single criminal record for you, Stephanie. And you were in Athens for what, 2 years? Athens, Georgia?
Yeah, about I think it was 2.5 to 3 years
Well,
to finish up my degree. Mm-hmm.
It's accurate that it's illegal to hoot loudly after 11 p.m. in Athens.
I can't believe that that's the case. It was funny. My husband now was my boyfriend then. We met at Warren Wilson, and we lived in Asheville in this warehouse district for a year that is now the arts district of, I don't know if you've been to the River Arts District of Asheville, but it's a very fancy fine art area. Well, it used to just be a bunch of rundown warehouses on the railroad lines. And we lived in a warehouse where residential living wasn't allowed. And so we had to sneak in and out of this warehouse that we lived in. It was freezing cold, 25-foot ceilings and brick, and the glass was all broken. It was freezing cold. So when I decided to go back to school, the reason I picked Athens is because it was warm. And and I was like, we're going to Georgia. My poor husband at the time, he was from Chicago, and this all coincided with 9/11, and so we ended up in Athens right at a time where you know, the country was united in some ways, but also that division that we still, you know, see today was really beginning. And so it was a shock leaving Asheville and Chapel Hill and ending up in Athens at that time. But I remember quite a few hooting and hollering after 11, especially if it had anything to do with a football game.
You were never arrested for it.
No, thank goodness.
Just to kind of bring it to context for people, I think there are probably some people joining us today who aren't really from Hillsborough. I hope there are. And so one of the things that I think you've kind of spearheaded in the last few years is a kind of a rethinking of the main street and especially the main couple of retail blocks of Main Street, which involved, I guess, getting rid of some parking spaces, which is in America is a kind of an issue. Widening some sidewalks, allowing for more sidewalk activity, which when I saw that, I thought, in my mind, I thought back to the old days of the kind of radical thing in the, I guess, the 70s of pedestrian malls, right? I guess that's what they were called. And I had my college years in Raleigh, where Fayetteville Street Mall, Fayetteville Street was closed to traffic and turned into, I think, one of the first kind of high-profile pedestrian malls, at least in the South. It lasted 25 years, I think, before other forces came around. So I think, I mean, we don't need to really talk about pedestrian malls. They seem to have kind of gone away. They've kind of turned into more mixed use things, but do you have an opinion on that? I mean, I'm guessing that you would say it's ridiculous to think you could close a street entirely to traffic. Maybe you shouldn't even want to do that. But do you have thoughts on that when you were thinking about that Churton Street project?
Sure. And actually, Athens, Georgia has a 1-block pedestrian mall right in front of the arch into the main entrance to campus. And it is the most boring place in all of Athens. It really is. And, you know, pedestrian mall, like, you know, going back all the way to Jane Jacobs, and really an understanding of urban environments is that they are the most alive when they're a little bit chaotic. And, you know, having a little bit of chaos and a little bit of conflict is actually a really good thing. And so, you know, having an area where you have, you know, people that are walking and people that are shopping and people that are eating and people that are driving. In Hillsborough, a lot of times when you're sitting at the Nickel or at Antonia's or at any of the other restaurants, someone drives by that you know, and they give you a little honk and you wave. And that relationship is something that doesn't exist in a completely pedestrian environment or in a completely vehicular environment. So it's that mixing of spaces and you know, sometimes it's loud and annoying, but that's part of it. You know, living in an urban area, it includes noise sometimes. But I think that we have a pretty good balance in downtown Hillsborough now. With, you know, one of the things that I really wanted to accomplish was additional landscaping. If you look back at the pictures from before the sidewalk project of some of the areas in town, it was bleak because there was no nature there. And so adding the street trees and adding the planters and doing the gardens and the Bank of America parking lot and sort of renovating the Mayo Park you know, seating area and bringing nature back into that urban area was actually one of my was one of the driving thoughts behind that, is that people need to see and relate and be around you know, plants. And so widening the sidewalks was necessary to get more landscaping downtown, and it also helped us to accomplish handicap accessibility, which is also something that's very important to me, and I think to our community as we, you know, bring Hillsborough into, you know, the 21st century. One of the things that we all have to be able to see and admit is where we were failing certain groups of people before, and so that the downtown was not accessible. And I think that the Downtown Sidewalks Project and Riverwalk too has given a lot more people access to downtown Hillsborough, which is helpful in community building as well.
Well, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about Riverwalk, which, you know, we could talk hours and hours. But Fran mentioned that I lived and worked in New York, and so I lived in Manhattan for 10 years. And it kind of became a joke. Here's this island, 13 miles long, surrounded by water, and you couldn't get to the water. You could never get to the water. I actually lived on Riverside Park for a couple of years, and I started calling it Highway Side Park because really it was a highway. And so when I sort of started to hang around Hillsborough, I thought, there's this river here, but you can't even see it from the bridge. When you're going across, you can't even, there was no, and then one day there was Stephanie in a green safety vest, and then there was Riverwalk. And it really is extraordinary. And I'm sure you would jump in and say that you really, it wasn't your idea, you guided it through, but really you spent a lot of energy making that happen. And it really is transformative to a small town. Maybe not to a large city, if a large city did that, because they've got other sort of places to do those sorts of things, but it has really been transformative. Kind of as you say, more not because of the river for me or the trail, but because people are there and you see people and it's an interaction point. And so go ahead and talk about, well, one thing I wondered is, since you did spend so many hours on bringing it about, so opening weekend, were you there sort of on your hands and knees scraping like chewing gum off the pavement? Yes, I know you were.
And so the day that Riverwalk opened, oh my God, I was so tired because we pushed so hard right at the end. We ran into some issues in the last couple of weeks, and we had a little patch of asphalt that failed, and we had to redo it, and it was exhausting. And anyway, by the time we got to the opening day, it was kind of like my wedding. I was just ready for it to be over. I just needed a break and a vacation. And I was so tired. So we had all these, Margaret wanted all of these bells. I don't know if you remember, there was these bells that people could ring on the bridges as they walked across the bridge for the first time. And so we had these hundreds.
Go ahead and explain who Margaret is.
Oh, Margaret Health is our assistant town manager and planning director, and she and I have been working together for 15 years. And so she was, as I was trying to actually build Riverwalk, she was thinking about what kind of celebration she's more of the event planner. I'm not so much of an event planner. So she had this idea that we would hang these bells on the bridge, and as people walked across the bridge, for the first time, they could ring a bell. And it was just sort of a sensory experience, and it was a great idea. So I had all of these little bells that needed to be hung up before, 9:30 in the morning or something. So I had them all stored along with a whole bunch of balloons and t-shirts and all this stuff in the Gold Park bathroom. And so I ran down to Gold Park at about 7:30 in the morning and grabbed all these t-shirts, and I had, 20 balloons in each hand, and all these bells like looped over my arm so they wouldn't get tangled. And I was walking through Gold Park as fast as I could, and who did I run into but Willem Dafoe was in Gold Park on the day that Riverwalk opened. And it was like, it was such a crazy experience because he was just asking me, like, where does this trail go? And I was like, well, funny you should ask. It's the first day that it's opened. Willem Dafoe. It was cool. And I kind of got in my brain for the rest of the day. I can't even remember the rest of Riverwalk, because I'm sure I looked like such a goofball with all these green and purple balloons tied to me, and trying to talk to celebrities doesn't always go well for me. But anyway, I'm sure that it was great. We planted a tree, and Tom Stevens gave a beautiful speech, and then I went on vacation. It was time.
Back, and you were scraping chewing gum off of the pavement.
Yes. Little bits of graffiti on the bridge with my fingernail. That's right.
So you connect Riverwalk to Willem Dafoe in your mind.
Mm-hmm. At least that opening day. Yeah, I just couldn't believe that happened. And some little kid came up to me on a bicycle as I was, after this happened, and he was like, the Green Goblin is here. The Green Goblin is here. It was just really a very random experience.
Well, yeah. It was huge for you, I'm sure, and as it is for the town. And I know that you've mentioned driving equipment. I know that when you were, it probably was hard for you to be a part of cutting down any of those trees. I kind of think of that when I walk down, because we don't like to cut down trees. And quite a few probably had to be removed. So for the greater purpose. So did you get to drive any of the big equipment?
Yeah, and actually cutting down the trees is a great story. We normally, when you clear a corridor for a greenway trail, you bring in a tree crew and they fell the trees. So, cut at the bottom and the trees fall down. When that happens, as the trees are falling, they knock into other trees and they damage branches of trees that are outside of your corridor you're trying to clear. And so a lot of times what you see are these corridors for greenways and road development too, that are much wider than they need to be because of all of the damage that has happened as you're clearing the site. And so we actually found this piece of equipment in Florida that is a traco that has this, long arm on it. And on the end of the arm is a big box that has a chipper and a vacuum inside, a giant vacuum. And so the town of Hillsborough was, smart enough to go ahead and pay the mobilization costs of bringing this piece of equipment to town. And what it allowed us to do was you stretch the arm all the way to the top of the tree and start chipping and basically chip the tree from the top down. And then all of the chips become soil stabilizers for the ground as the traco drives over, which then of course protects from erosion, and it protects the river water quality because there's no runoff, because the chips, like mulch in your garden, provide stabilization. And so we cleared the entire trail in about 3 days and didn't cause any damage to the edges, to the trees on the edges, because this piece of equipment could work singly with each tree that we wanted to take out. And I think in a lot of ways that helped the success of Riverwalk overall, because as soon as it opened, it felt like it had been there for years because it's a very narrow corridor. In some places, it's only 20 to 25 feet wide. And we were able to maintain those trees on the edges. So that was actually, I think, one of the greatest things that we did to sort of preserve the environment with that project. And I didn't get to drive that piece of equipment because it was, you had to have special training. But in my career, I've driven a lot of big tracos and backhoes and dump trucks. I drove a motor grader once, which is absolutely the hardest piece of machinery to drive. And I didn't do a very good job. I tore up a soccer field. Really good with that one. But
it's a perk. It's a perk of your job.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess in terms of planning and thinking of public space, there's a lot of talk these days about public space in terms of how it's used and in terms of how it attracts people, how it functions when a lot of people are there. And it's because we've seen a lot of, let's say, street demonstrations in the last many months or couple of years, really, at least all over the world. And I ran across this pretty great quote that you probably already know from the architect Charles Moore, who said, "When the revolution starts, there should be no question of where to go," which is so true, and often is obvious in most towns. And we're also hearing a lot of discussion about race relations in this country. Hillsborough has seen over the last few years some race-related demonstrations and outpourings of people and voices on all sides. So I guess for you, is this a sort of a daily part of your discussions about Hillsborough? Specifically about race, or even just race related, but more broadly about where do people go to come together to share their voices? And I think for people who don't live in Hillsborough, or Hillsborough has a kind of a default place, which has become the yard in front of the old courthouse. I guess that would be true. If people are thinking of let's have a demonstration, it would be in the yard in front of the old courthouse. Do you think about that? Do you think about we need a better place for people to come together and have and protest? Or tell us what you're thinking on that.
Well, I do think Hillsborough as a courthouse town, originally designed and laid out on a grid street pattern, lends itself, and as the county seat, in the middle of Orange County, it lends itself to, large events and, you know, protests and demonstrations to be right downtown. There's so much visibility right there on Churton Street. I think that one of the projects that I've been able to work on that I've been really proud of is trying to open up River Park, which is behind the Justice facility. It's a very large green space that's been there for years, but it didn't have very much visibility before. And so in working with some of my colleagues at Orange County, you know, we designed that connection across from Weaver Street with the stairs and the bus stop and the rain garden into River Park. And that was really sort of the final piece of the sidewalk project. Because as you know, the courthouse, the historic courthouse square is not very large.
Right.
You know, it's pretty crowded, even just for last Friday's events. It gets pretty crowded, and it's also, you know, so close to Churton Street that sometimes it can be hard to hear if you're trying to have some, like at our some of our Martin Luther King Jr. Day marches. It's been hard to hear speakers because motorcycles and trucks are going by on the road. And so I definitely think about those things. You know, where can we have events and demonstrations where we can hear the speakers that we've collected to see? And I think that River Park, behind the Justice facility, is actually a place that will see more events like that happen in the future. Now that those entrances and handicap accessibility has been established, it's going to be a lot easier for people to park in the parking deck and then just come straight across the street and get down into River Park, not just for protests and demonstrations, but also for events like the River Park Festival, you know, music events or movies on the lawn or other arts and crafts fairs and festivals that can happen in Hillsborough. So that's been a project that was, you know, sort of the final piece of the downtown sidewalk expansion project, and it's just been completed here in the last couple months. And I've been, you know, I'm just really happy to see it and hope that it eases people's, you know, access into that park. It's a beautiful part of town.
It is. But it's sort of also kind of true that if you're having there's sort of various kinds of demonstrations. There are the ones which are more marches, which move,
Mm-hmm.
and don't really have a destination. There are ones which are just gatherings at a sort of a destination. And then there are ones which move towards a gathering in an open space, it seems. But it's sort of interesting. I was thinking back on some of the global demonstrations, and often the demonstrations become named for the place that they happen. We think of Tiananmen Square. We don't think of another name for that, and Tahrir Square.
Mm-hmm.
So these things become iconic, and there's a difference between a street demonstration and a square demonstration. They have a different feel. So, and I think just quickly about Halifax Mall in Raleigh, where most sort of state demonstrations have happened. When Halifax Mall was kind of first created, it was a kind of a big empty space, and people said, oh, this is hollow and soulless, and they're just sort of government buildings that ring it. Well, it's turned into kind of a good space for demonstrations because it's enormous. There are no trees that block visibility, and there's a kind of an amphitheater effect because there's something behind the speakers. So that's a kind of an ironic occurrence there. There's a lot going on in Hillsborough. We don't have time to talk about it. There's an entire expansion, widening of Churton Street. There are 1,000 new families moving in to south of town. Many changes are going to be happening. Changes have already happened. Changes always happen. And I know you think about that. You have to think about that. But the question that always seems to come up is everyone says, you know, you'll be sitting at dinner, oh, Hillsborough is over with, or Hillsborough has changed forever, or it's not like it used to be. Do you think it's possible for a town to lose itself? Is that even a thing?
I think, I don't mean to throw Chapel Hill under the bus, but I think Chapel Hill has lost itself in some ways. But that, you know, that's such a typical response from someone who grew up somewhere and then is now looking back on it, you know, 45 years later. When I was growing up in Chapel Hill, it was a very small town, and like we couldn't even get into any trouble as teenagers because all the shop owners knew who our parents were. And so now when I go to Chapel Hill, it feels very large and anonymous to me. So I guess it's possible for things to really change. And in that change, I'm sure some things are lost, but I also think some things are gained. And we can't hide from the fact that 1 million more people are going to be moving to the Triangle. And that's because we live in a really awesome part of the country from a, I mean, you're right between the mountains and the beach, the Tar Heels are here. There's so many reasons to live here, from jobs to a good quality of living, to education, to culture and events, that, people want to live here and they're going to move here. And when they do, the question is not, how do we stop it? But the question is, how do we build in a way that's more sustainable and that's smarter? And we'll make mistakes along the way, but I believe in incremental improvements. And I think that we just have to stay hopeful and stay plugged in and recognize when we make mistakes that aren't working for everyone, and be willing to be accountable for those, and then to go back and make things better, slowly, one step at a time. And sometimes it moves a lot slower than people would like. Transportation is one of the segments of my job that moves a lot slower than I would like. I've been working on the train station already for 7 years, and we haven't broke ground yet. And now, of course, it's on hold at the moment. But but those are also the reasons why, I get up in the morning and keep doing it, because I know that if I keep pestering the right people, and we as a community collectively make our voices heard about the things that we care about, then we can move towards that better future. But we're never going to get there. And in the process of getting there, I'm sure that there are some things that will feel lost and different to people who grew up around here. And I think it's really important to listen to that and to see if there's a better way of doing things. Some things about our past, I think that it's time to leave. And, we have to be willing to admit that Hillsborough hasn't always been a place that was welcoming for everyone. And I believe that part of my job is to try to find opportunities for equity and opportunities for community building. And so hopefully I'm in the right career, because I feel like I have those opportunities all the time.
It seems that way from the outside looking. And as a designer myself, of course, I think of these things when I walk around. And as a user of towns and cities, I try to be aware. And I try to be vocal about what I think. If there's an opportunity to be vocal, people should be vocal. And speaking of that, since you live in Hillsborough, not only do you work, but you live, and you have a family in Hillsborough, do you ever put on a disguise just so you can go have a cup of coffee without people asking you when the train station is going to open? You put on dark glasses? Or do
No.
you do that?
I really don't mind talking about my work, because it's the only thing that's really me. Everything else belongs to my kids. Every other part of me is them. And so I actually really enjoy it when people ask me questions. And I live in such a perfect place for that. I can be outside, working in my garden, and folks will just, walk by. Even now during COVID, we have our masks on, but we can stand, 10, 12 feet apart. And just in the last couple of days, I've been talking to new neighbors that I hadn't even met before about these, the RTLP development and Collins Ridge, and people ask me questions, and I really don't mind. I don't put on a disguise. I did leave Facebook. I did deactivate. So for those of you who are my friends on Facebook, I just decided I needed that, hour of my life back this year, and less, social media. So anyway, people know where I live. They know where to find me, and I'll run into people also around town.
Okay, so everyone, Stephanie doesn't mind being asked questions on the feed.
Not at all.
But you mentioned your children. Do you really try to not bring your work home, as they say? Or are they interested, and you like talking to them about what's going on in town?
Oh no, they think that they own this place. They really do. They think Riverwalk is theirs. I'm so sorry. I mean, my son, you know, when he was like 2 and 3 years old, he used to stand out in our front yard and people would walk by and he'd say, "Who are you?" I mean, like he owns this place. You know, Witt's frozen custard belongs to him as far as he's concerned. You know, he knows all the people at Paul's on the Corner. You know, he is friends with everybody in West Hillsborough. And no, they're really interested in the projects. And my son in particular, one day I heard him, he was about maybe 5, and I think Lily was about 2.5 at the time, and they were playing with wooden blocks. And they had built this whole city, you know, out of wooden blocks to drive the Matchbox cars on. And Lily was building something and she said, "Look, Sam, it's a sidewalk." And he said, there's no stormwater system. You don't have curb and gutter. It's not a real sidewalk. You know, of course, he's the older brother and has to tear it down. But at the same time, as a proud mother, I was glad that he was thinking about, what are we going to do with this new impervious surface? He was 5 then. So yeah, no, I talk about my work all the time, and I think about my work all the time. It never stops. And that's just how I am, and I love it. I don't need to turn it off. Sometimes I have to turn it off to put my kids' priorities first. But as soon as they've been fed and put to bed, then I still like to, you know, to really daydream about what kinds of things we can build together, you know, 10, 20, and 30 years in the future.
Well, and having children also makes you remember that people have all kinds of families. They need spaces that work for all kinds of, I don't have children, so it's easy for me to just think about how do I get myself here and there. So, I mean, for everyone who's listening, Stephanie's also a kickboxer. So if you ask too many questions, keep a distance, I guess.
That's right. Watch out.
So I guess we need to maybe wrap up pretty soon. I wondered if you think is it good to be from the town that you're working for, planning for, or can you imagine getting dropped in the middle of, say, Nebraska and doing this for a town that you really have no history with?
I think it would be harder. I do think it would be harder. I think it has worked to my advantage to be from here, you know, to be born and raised in Orange County. There are times that's helpful. Because it gives me a perspective. And I also, you know, my dad's a contractor, and so he's worked for a lot of people. I have my community and his community overlap. And my mom was, worked at the hospital for years. And it's just, you know, it's such a small place, like it'll overlap. So sometimes it helps to be able to say, I think you know my dad. And then, you know, and then you got to in with someone. Yeah, but I can imagine working in other places. I think I would have to spend the first couple years listening. If I ever moved and worked somewhere else, I would have to do a lot of catch up and a lot of listening. Whereas I do feel like I have sort of a natural advantage here, just having having that perspective of seeing how things have changed and grown. And have, you know, just listening to the people all my life and what kinds of issues and complaints and problems that have come up in the past.
So Stephanie, 50 years from now, after you've become an international planning consultant, you've planned cities on Mars, all your books have been published, and you retire back to Hillsborough. Is Hillsborough gonna kind of look the same, feel kind of the same? Or can you even imagine what it will feel?
I hope it's still green. I hope that we grow in a way that honors the environment here, the river, and the forests. We're forest dwellers here. The forest is all around us. And I hope that we grow in a way that is more sustainable in the future than it's been in the past, and that we continue to there's such an amazing wealth of knowledge about the natural world and wildlife and horticulture and a sort of a systems approach to design, I think, is the next wave. And it's not just what Hillsborough needs, but it's really what the earth needs. You know, the earth needs us to be thinking about how to build more in line with nature and more sustainably. So in 50 years, I hope it's still green here. And I think that we have a lot to be proud of in this town for preserving the parts of the environment, you know, the mountain and the speedway, not just for recreation, but for for conservation. And Orange County has done an incredible work over, the last decades to conserve land. And that's something that I hope that continue, River Association, I could go on and on, Triangle Land Conservancy, all of these organizations that are working to preserve and conserve land for the future they're the champions, actually.
Right, and I guess one of the points is it doesn't just happen. People have to be advocates. And so talking about plants, and I know you're a gardener, and especially flowering plants, what are you currently obsessed with?
Oh, that's a hard question. So many things. So I have been struggling to get a fig tree to work in my yard for about 3 years, and I finally have one that's happy. And so that is my daily meditation in my yard, is just to go out and thank this fig tree for not having died so far. So I'm really looking forward to having figs. But I also think mountain mint works in just about every situation. So if anyone's really looking for a great pollinator plant that's just so helpful to the environment and really easy to grow, mountain mint is a winner. Of course, Joe Pye weed and milkweed, my pollinator garden in my yard in general. But I'll always also be someone who loves my snowball viburnums and climbing roses too. So I have a mix in my yard of native and sort of adapted non-invasive species, and I do really love to be surrounded by flowers. So anyway, gardening is definitely a love of my life. It's where I rejuvenate and weed a lot.
Well, congratulations on your fig tree.
Yay!
Figs mean life. Fig trees mean life.
That's right.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much for wanting to do this with us, and for everything in Hillsborough. Don't go.
Okay.
I wish we could go on and on. This is fabulous. I want to remind you that on the Burwell School site, you can see previous programs we've done. You can see this program. It will be posted next week sometime. You might want to see a program called The Mad Women of Hillsborough, which is very enticing. And there's also a PayPal box you can click for donations in case you're inspired. We have some questions. I have a question. Stephanie, is there ever going to be a swimming pool in Hillsborough, public swimming pool?
There is a swimming pool already in Hillsborough, Valley Park swimming pool. I don't know if they're open right now, but it's a great family pool. It's privately owned. There's also the Sportsplex, which is an indoor swimming pool, but you can be a member of the Sportsplex, and they've got great programs and all kinds of wonderful things that they do. In terms of a town-owned swimming pool as a facility, I don't think there will be one in my lifetime. And the reason is we don't have a Parks and Recreation department. We actually don't provide recreation programming. All of the programs that are done around here are provided by Orange County. The town of Hillsborough, we build facilities, and then we rely on other organizations like Hillsborough Youth Athletic Association, HYAA, and of course Orange County, and so on and so forth. We really rely on these other nonprofits and government entities that have larger budgets and more staff to do programming. And a swimming pool is an incredibly expensive endeavor. And I think that we have a master plan for every single park in Hillsborough. We have master plans for connectivity, for greenways, for trails, for sidewalks. There are so many needs that have already been identified as priorities that I can't imagine we're going to work our way all the way down the list to where a new swimming pool would occur. But I will say that for people who are interested in joining a pool, they should check out Valley Park because it's a lot of fun.
Okay, questions. John Bierman writes, my concern is about the level of vehicular noise in our town. I've heard him complain about trains too. It's way too loud and disturbing of the peace. How can we address that?
It kind of depends on what noise that he's talking about. In terms of traffic noise, Churton Street is not a truck route. It's a non-truck route, and yet 11% of the traffic on Churton Street before it was a non-truck route was large trucks. And now that it is a non-truck route, 11% of the traffic is still large trucks. And so I think that that's really more of an enforcement issue. And I've heard that it's very hard to enforce, for our police department to enforce, getting trucks to go to the route they're supposed to take, which is down to Efland, to that Efland exit. Near, let's see, what is that? Ben Jonson Road exit is where the truck route is. And so anyway, the trucks are a difficult issue to deal with. I also know just from living next to Nash Street that we have a lot of like revving motorcycles in town at certain times of the year. And I think that the police could probably enforce our noise ordinances. But again, it just comes down to whether or not that's a priority. We're a small town and it's hard to enforce everything. In terms of the train whistle, which is very loud, also across from the street from my house, the trains have to blow for safety, of course, at any on-grade crossing. And the only way to stop that is to not have on-grade crossings, which there is a plan in place that lessens the amount of on-grade crossings in Hillsborough, but it's probably it's probably going to take many years to make those changes, because any change to the rail corridor tends to be very, very expensive and difficult to construct.
Right. Catherine Phelps asks, is it allowed to have speed bumps on West King Street? For stop signs.
Yes, I just had a conversation with someone about this yesterday. So King Street is a state road, which means that it is owned, that right of way where the road is paved plus the sidewalks and space on either side of the road is owned and maintained by the State Department of Transportation. And most of our big roads in town are state roads. On town roads, we have our town board, our elected officials have the control to determine, speed limits and traffic calming and design changes. But when it comes to state roads, it has to be something that is approved by the Department of Transportation. And we have been working now for about 5 years with the DOT to get a plan approved to add on-street parking to the sides of West King Street between Wake and Hassel Street, otherwise known as Hazel Street. And so when that on-street parking is added, it will narrow the view corridor. And at the same time, they've allowed us to drop the speed limit slightly in that section because of the on-street parking. There's all kinds of rules and standards when it comes to making changes on state roads. So I feel like we were making progress, at least as far as Hassel Street. However, I think a lot of the people who asked this question have concerns about that next portion of King Street, which goes up to Nash and then of course over into West Hillsborough. And that is a project that we just need to continue to work on contacting DOT about and letting them know that there's issues. But speed bumps are not something that the DOT generally allows on state roads. And so it would be easier if it was a town road.
Jeff Carmian asks all panelists, what towns inspired you?
Do you want to go first, Jimmy?
Me?
Yeah. He asked all panelists. I feel like I've been talking for so long. Do you have a town that inspired you?
Well, I think Hillsborough is actually pretty inspiring. You know, but it's obvious to say because I get to see the changes that happen, and I know enough to know that what probably went into the decisions. But if you dropped me into a place, I have to say Manhattan is pretty inspiring to me. And ironically, because of the green spaces that visionary people said had to happen. It's just almost thrilling to me and mind-boggling that those green spaces exist in those places, which when I lived there, I gravitated to those green places. But it's also just kind of fascinating. How would you make a gigantic city work at all? And
Absolutely.
it does kind of work. So
Yeah, I think for me, I really love Savannah, Georgia. It's one of my favorite places to visit. It's such a beautiful town and just a fantastic street grid network that works really well with these, you know, garden squares worked in. And from a planning perspective, it's just a great town. But also, I find a lot of inspiration in the Netherlands, which is where my grandparents are from. And I haven't actually been to Holland, which is something that I hope to remedy. I'd like to take my kids there. My husband has been several times for training for his job. But the bike networks and the greenways and the wildlife corridors, the transportation system, and also some of the sustainable design elements in the Netherlands, I've done a lot of research and I've studied. Because I think in many ways, you know, they're sort of further along than we are here. So I find that really inspiring and at the same time kind of frustrating because there's a lot of stuff that we can't, you know, you can't just copy and paste from the Netherlands to America.
Well, I think we might be done. It's 4:04. Any further comments?
Well, I don't want to stop.
I know.
This has been so much fun. I really appreciate you guys asking me. Thank you so much.
Stephanie, I guess I would say, because we're getting questions, obviously, from people who have specific questions about what's really going on in the town. Can you just tell people quickly where to go to get this kind of information? Is there a place really that, since you're no longer on Facebook?
Not on Facebook. Yeah, so if you have a question about the new development proposed near I-40, RTLP, then you really need to talk to Orange County because that development is not in the town of Hillsborough city limits and we do not have the review application. If you have questions about Collins Ridge or transportation planning or future greenways and trails and connectivity, you're welcome to get in touch with me and I'll point you in the right direction in Hillsborough. But just Hillsborough is actually a very small town. And so depending on you know, where you live, a lot of people think they live in Hillsborough, but they don't because their address is Hillsborough. But on our town website, we have a map that actually shows the town limits and extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is where we have planning authority. And if your question is about something within that area, then the best bet is to contact either me or other planning staff at the town. But if your question is an Orange County question, then you really need to go to Orange County Planning Department, which that can be kind of hard to communicate with people sometimes. But the easiest way to get in touch with me is just via email, which is stephanie.trueblood@hillsboronc.gov.
Or come knock on your door on a Sunday morning.
Or yeah, I'll be in the yard weeding.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who joined us. I think we had another standing room only crowd if we had been at the Burwell School, which is really gratifying.
Thank you, Fran.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.
Okay.
See you in town.